I'm very excited to be here today. We've following on the keynote that we had this morning with Lorianne LaRocco. We've got somebody else coming on to talk big picture about what's happening around the world. And I'm very excited about this panel. Eddie Fishman is one of the world's leading authorities on economic statecraft. He's a senior fellow and director of the Greenberg Center for Geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations and an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He also advises companies on geopolitical strategy and invests in early-stage technology startups. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Excellent book. I've been working my way through it. I've now got it on audiobook, so I can listen to it in the car and when I'm traveling. Highly recommend it. And I would like to welcome Eddie to the stage, and we're going to have a fireside chat for a few minutes. Come on up, Eddie. Well, Eddie, I get the Rolling Stones, and you get whoever that was to walk up on stage.
It was great. I like the music. I agree. I feel like a rock star up here.
Gotta love that's all Allison. Well, hey, we're gonna get right into it because in reviewing your book, and then also in thinking about our forum and the things that we do, we could easily spend an hour or more on these subjects, and we've got a half hour, so we're just gonna get right into it. Just setting the stage. Your book opens on how the initial efforts to sanction Iran were built. Of course, we talked about that earlier, and you were actually part of that process. Energy is a through line throughout the book in some ways, mostly in how sanctions on Iran and Russia were designed to minimize the impact on energy prices. Your book wraps up before the current situation in Iran and also briefly notes that China maintains choke points on the clean energy supply chain. Let's get started just getting your take on the current state of affairs and kind of putting all that in context.
Yeah, sure. So look, the United States in many ways created the modern forms of economic warfare. My book is called Choke Points because what has changed about economic warfare in the last 25 years, we moved from a system in which when you wanted to impose hard-hitting economic pain on another country, you needed to use military force, naval blockades or sieges, to one where we live in such a globalized economy where there are these single points of failure, what I call choke points, that single countries can actually impose substantial economic pain on others without using military force. So you brought up Iran. When we were working on the sanctions against Iran in the early 2010s in the Obama administration, we successfully cut Iran's oil sales from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day in about 18 months, so by 60% decline. We didn't use a single ship. We didn't interdict Iranian oil sales. All we did was go around the world to refineries in India and banks in China and Singapore and threaten to cut them off from the dollar unless they decrease their purchases of Iranian oil. Sort of a more nonviolent form of economic warfare. But what's happened, Ray, is that in the last few years, other countries have realized that they have choke points too that they can weaponize, right? The single biggest geoeconomic story of last year, 2025, was not Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. It was China's own export controls on rare earth elements, right? Within weeks, Ford had to idle a factory for its Explorer SUV. Raytheon had to scour the globe looking for alternative supplies for rare earths to make its Tomahawk cruise missiles. And then this year, we're only a few months into it, but still, the biggest geoeconomic story of 2026 has been Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, weaponizing one of its choke points against the United States. So I think what we're seeing is both this year and last year, it's been another country, a rival of the United States, taking this sort of lesson of how you fight economic wars, putting it into force against the US. And of course, for both rare earths and the Strait of Hormuz, a through line is that these are critical for energy systems.
Got it. It's interesting you mentioned Forge because I actually had a question for you on that. So we saw that China's worldwide solar exports doubled in the last month to 68 gigawatts, which is a huge number. How did efforts like Project Forge and other to address these choke points on critical minerals and others? And can you tell us whether there are other strategies that we should be pursuing to support domestic industries to compete in the face of capacity issues.
So look, you always have to be cautious in the middle of a geopolitical crisis to zoom out and project what this is going to mean 5 or 10 years down the road, right? We're still in sort of an active war between the US and Iran. We don't exactly know how it's going to end, although I'm happy to speculate. One of the easiest bets, one of the easiest macro bets coming out of this war is that it's going to lead the vast majority of the countries around the world to double down on clean energy. Wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, because nobody wants to be beholden to Iran closing access to 20% of the global supply for oil and liquefied natural gas. It's not a tenable place to be. And so to Ray, to your point, it doesn't surprise me that we've seen absolute records being shattered for China exporting solar panels in just the last few months to many of these countries that are vulnerable for import disruptions from oil from the Strait of Hormuz. So look, what does that mean from a geopolitical standpoint? It might be great for the clean energy transition if we get accelerated adoption of solar, wind, et cetera. But from the perspective of US leverage, I mean, it's a concerning world if the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Indians become completely dependent on China for clean energy technologies. And right now, across all those industries we mentioned, China's got 70 to 90% market share, whether it's batteries, electric vehicles, solar. These are industries where China is dominating. So what that tells me from the US standpoint is we really do need to find ways to produce alternatives, because the world is moving in this direction. And if China is the only one sort of at the table producing these technologies, we don't have US companies in the game. We don't have allied supply chains that don't involve China. It's going to have significant geopolitical ramifications down the road.
Gotcha. So because you dangled it out there, I got to ask. So how do you think the Iran conflict's going to play out? And when you think about things starting to normalize, if I can use that description, how long, how to put this differently, if there was a solution that was reached this week, how long would it take for things to start to normalize again?
Sure. So I think it's helpful to explain really where we are right now, because in some ways, the oil price shock through the Strait of Hormuz has not been as bad as many expected, right? We've lost effectively 1 billion barrels of oil that otherwise would have been exported over the last 10 weeks because of the disruption of Hormuz. If you had told any energy analyst you lose 1 billion barrels of oil over a 10-week period, our oil price is only going to be $110 a barrel, they'd say, you're crazy. You know, we should have $200 a barrel oil or something like that. Well, the reason is that, first of all, this year we were entering a world where supply was going to outstrip demand. That's why the International Energy Agency projected oil prices to be in the 50s coming into this year. And frankly, the system is working. All these buffers around the world, whether it's China that has a 1.5 billion barrel stockpile of oil, has been decreasing their imports by about 5 million barrels a day. The United States has record exports of oil. The challenge is those exports are not coming from new production. They're coming from drawing down commercial inventories and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So what's that mean? Over time, that's going to run out, right? You're not going to have these inventories forever. And I think in some sort of ironic way, the fact that oil prices haven't gone higher has prevented Trump from having the incentive to actually cut a deal. And so we're in this odd situation that the longer this goes on, the likely we are that the inventories run out and we actually are forced to make some sort of a deal. Final point here before handing it back over to you. Sure. There are really two options that we have to reopen, if you want to say, the Strait of Hormuz. Option one is diplomacy. You cut a deal with the Iranians that may be somewhat humiliating because it'll look a lot like the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Trump exited, may wind up involving Iran having some control over the strait in terms of tolling ships, which may be a plausible outcome, if not a very negative one for US power. That's option one. Trump doesn't like that because it's somewhat humiliating. Option two is substantial military escalation. You know, putting boots on the ground, actually going for a regime change in Iran the way we did in 2003 with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Well, I don't have to tell a room full of Americans, there's no political support for that in the United States. So door one, which is a humiliating deal, is not very appealing. Door two, which is an Iraq-style invasion, which no one in America supports, is pretty unappealing. And so instead of going through either of those unappealing doors, you have the United States sort of ambling around, not choosing. And so I think what we have right now is a very dangerous scenario where we don't want to cut a deal, we don't want to escalate militarily, but the longer this goes on, the lower the inventories get, and the closer we get to this really mammoth price spike that will affect all of us.
Okay, so that does sound pretty unappealing. And at the same time, if an agreement was reached, turning the spigot on just doesn't happen quickly. It has to oil production needs to ramp up. The ships need to be filled. The ships need to get to where they're going to be, and then they need to start deploying around the world again, which all takes a significant amount of time. How long do you think we'll be living with prices at the $100 a barrel or higher as a result of just the logistics?
Yeah, the logistics are non-trivial, right? I mean, just in terms of moving around the ships, dealing with shut-ins and ramping back up production, it would probably take 3 to 6 months for sure. The thing I'm more worried about, and by the way, I should mention, it's a slightly different story for natural gas because the world's biggest LNG facility, Ras Laffan in Qatar, has actually sustained significant damage, right? Where it could take years to get production back up to the level that it was before the war started in February. But I have maybe an additional take on this, which is, yes, you'll have 3 to 6 months, but if we had 130, 140 ships going through Hormuz a day before the war, the odds that we get back to that level, even in the next year, is extremely low, right? Extremely, extremely low. One major lesson from my book, Choke Points, from economic warfare, is that it's much easier to ratchet up the risk calculus of the private sector to make things seem risky than it is to make the private sector think that something doesn't have risk, right? And so you're going to have some commercial shippers that are very hesitant to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Or if we get a situation where Iran is charging a toll, there could be certain countries that say, we're just not willing to pay a toll. We're not going to do it. Or Iran, by the way, has said that countries that impose sanctions on Iran will not be able to cross the Strait of Hormuz even if they do pay a toll. And so I think that a great scenario would be one where we get to 60, 70 ships a day. So that's still much lower than we were in the status quo ante.
So we're basically, best case scenario, we're still looking at an impact from this economically in the United States for a year, maybe more.
Certainly, yeah. Look, I mean, the U.S. is in kind of an odd position now because we are by far the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, both, right? So in some ways, there are people in the United States, there are businesses in the United States who benefit from higher oil prices, right? It's not bad for everyone, the same way that it was 10, 20 years ago. That said, you are already seeing really significant impacts playing out across the U.S. economy. I think 50% of Americans have already cut back the amount that they're driving because of gasoline prices. We've got gasoline prices, the last I checked, average national gasoline price about $4.50. In New York, obviously, it's a lot higher than that. I shudder every time I have to fill up my tank driving around. I think we have a third of Americans who have already said that they are changing their summer vacation plans because of higher airline ticket prices and because of other savings. So this is having an impact. And of course, inflation, we just got a number a couple days ago, 3.8% in the United States. That's the highest it's been in 3 years. So there are really significant domestic economic ramifications that we're going to live with. I think there are significant geopolitical ramifications, which we talked about in terms of China, I think, getting significant leverage over the rest of the world. And I'm hopeful that this administration coming out of this crisis can realize that energy dominance has to mean an across-the-board energy strategy. It can't just mean oil and gas. It has to mean wind, solar, EVs, batteries, because those are the energies of the future. That's an area that's growing around the world that's going to grow even faster coming out of this crisis.
Got it. Appreciate that. Just for everybody, the Slido thing is up. Please submit questions, and if we have time, we'll try to get to them during the discussion that we have here. Let's talk for a minute about clean energy and supply chain resilience. So solar panels, batteries, critical minerals, wind components. Much of the clean energy supply chain runs through China. You just mentioned that a minute ago. How exposed is the U.S. clean energy build-out to the same choke point dynamics that you talk about in your book?
We are exposed. I think we're less exposed than other parts of the world. In some of the higher end components that we source, we're able to pay premium prices not to have Chinese components. I'm actually a little bit more worried about companies around the world, countries around the world that don't have that ability, right? That are really only paying for sort of the lowest cost. They're not willing to sort of go to the lengths that we are in the United States. That said, I mean, in the electric vehicle industry, for instance, there's a reason we have 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. We would be non-competitive, right, if we were to import Chinese electric vehicles at anything close to a reasonable market price. You're now seeing an active debate here in the United States about whether we should be striking joint ventures with Chinese battery companies, with Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers here in the United States to produce onshore, learn how they've achieved the sort of proficiency that they have in recent decades. I'm sure that will be something that's discussed currently between, during the Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing, right? Is that a part of the investment that we want here in the US? So look, I think that we are exposed. We're a little bit better off than the rest of the world. We're also, in some ways, preventing these technologies from coming in. And of course, we haven't even talked about FIAC and other things like that. But I do worry that even if the US can go on as long as we can without increasing our own dependence on China, if our allies become more dependent on China, that has significant ripple effects on the United States as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Appreciate that. Let me pull on that thread a little further. The Inflation Reduction Act was designed in part to onshore clean energy manufacturing. From an economic statecraft perspective, did we thread the needle correctly, or did we leave ourselves exposed in ways that really we haven't reckoned with yet?
You know, I'm a big supporter of what the Congress was trying to accomplish with the Inflation Reduction Act, because I do think that we are operating at a disadvantage vis-a-vis China in a lot of these industries, and which is a shame because solar, for instance, we invented solar panels here in the United States. It's an industry, right, that we created. And for a lot of these technologies, right, we did a lot of the basic research, but then China scaled the technology. And that's because, private capital historically hasn't been as friendly allocating to some of these technologies as they have been, and whereas China, you have these massive subsidies it's really hard to compete with. So I do think it's important to have some state support. I think the IRA had sort of, we only had a couple years, right, before it was changed pretty significantly last year. I think it was delivering some results. The thing I think is a lesson from Chinese industrial policy is that, it's important, I think, to intervene also on the demand side, right? And I think this actually applies to the US, where we actually have the world's best capital markets. If you make sure that there is a market for something, if something is going to be profitable, I trust the private sector to make the allocation decisions. So I do worry a little bit about pulling back some of the benefits through the IRA. We're never going to get it exactly right between the build out and economic security. But right now, given sort of the level of catch up we have to do vis-a-vis China, I'm all in favor of trying to accelerate the build out and sort of taking care of the rest later.
Yeah, let me ask you a question that comes up all the time, and it's about tariffs, trade controls, versus incentives like the advanced manufacturing tax credit. So we've had tariffs for years, and there's a strategic purpose for those, right? But increasingly, politicians talk about it as an incentive to bring to onshore manufacturing and supply chains. At the same time, you could argue that tariffs, because of their nature, don't provide the long-term durability that investors need to put tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in factory investments in the States. And then in comes the advanced manufacturing tax credit, which is a completely different carrot approach. Here's 10 years of a very robust incentive. And we saw in 2 years, the last 2 years of the Biden administration, 160 manufacturers, factories proposed in the United States. How do you reconcile that? Or can tariffs be used effectively as an economic incentive plan for reshoring?
I think they can, but I don't think that they can be your only tool, right? And this is an active debate, by the way, where say, well, do we need tariffs or do we need incentives, right? I think the honest truth is you probably need a combination of both. When it comes to, for instance, we're talking about electric vehicles. Without the tariffs on Chinese EVs, there's really no way we're going to be competitive, right? We're going to just import the Chinese EVs, right? So you need that. But to your point, if we actually want to incentivize the build out of factories and stuff like that, I do think that tax credits are an important part of the equation too. Something that's a really challenging question, and I don't think anyone has the answer to this, is what's the most sort of politically survivable tool in the U.S. system? The challenge with tax credits always is that they become this political football. One administration puts them in place, the next says this was a boondoggle, we got to get rid of it, et cetera. I mean, tariffs maybe have a little bit more longevity for not always the best reasons. So I think you need a combination of both.
Interesting. Okay. I'd love to unpack that with you further. So let me just keep going down the line of tariffs and trade controls. Allies are increasingly frustrated. The EU, Japan, South Korea, feeling caught between the United States' economic pressure on China and their own dependencies. How durable is the coalition that we need to make economic statecraft actually work in this instance?
So, I spent a lot of time in Europe, in Canada, in other countries that I guess are traditional U.S. allies, and there's a lot of anxiety, right? Any of you guys who travel around, they're very worried about the direction of the United States, and I think that's because for the age of economic warfare for the last 25 years, yes, the U.S. has been weaponizing different parts of the global economy, but it's been against China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, countries that most people would consider to be rivals of the United States. In the past year, we've seen that list grow exponentially, right? We now see significant tariffs against, Mexico and Canada, against Europe, against Japan, Korea, India for part of the time last year was hit with a 50% tariff, right? For decades of trying to bring India closer to us. So I worry a lot about that. I think that the discussion, even in Europe now, you're hearing more talk about de-risking from the United States, right? We talk about foreign entities of concern. We don't want to get on other countries' list of foreign entities of concern. So I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think all is lost. I think that there's still very deep reasons for us to be allied with these countries. But we don't want to push our luck too much. So I think it's going to be incumbent on the Trump administration in the coming years to build on partnerships like Forge, like you mentioned, to show that there really are still, there's still an interest from Washington in multilateralism and working with our allies.
Got it. If you were advising a clean energy developer or financier today, what single geopolitical variable you'd tell them to watch most closely for over the next 18 months?
Oh, man. Well, if we're going to go in the next 18 months, I mean,
12?
Yeah, but even that's still very near term, right?
Okay.
And near term, the Hormuz thing, I think, in the Iran conflict is still, we don't appreciate it yet in the United States, how big of a change this is, right? We're going from a world where Hormuz, this waterway where you get 20% of oil, 20% of LNG, a third of fertilizer, a third of helium every single day, moving from an international waterway to one where arguably our biggest adversary controls it, has effectively put themselves in charge as a gatekeeper, where they can say, your ship goes through, your ship doesn't. I just saw before coming here, Ray, that the Japanese just cut another side deal with Iran to get another one of their tankers through. Right? That's a world where one of our key allies has to negotiate directly at the level of the Prime Minister, Taikichi, directly with the Iranians to get their tankers through. Right? That's a huge change in terms of how our energy system works. If I were anywhere in your industry, I would be modeling out what are the second, third, fourth order consequences of this, and how do I deploy capital now in order to benefit from that into the future.
Okay, got it. Fascinating. We're going to take a couple of these questions too. They're starting to really pop up here. Do you expect other countries, e.g. China, to follow Iran's model of demanding fees for safe passage through other waterways?
This is a very important topic. I hosted a small roundtable at CFR the other day. It was off the record, so I can't name names, but the visitor was a very senior person from Singapore. And he was mentioning that they're petrified there that Indonesia now might put a toll on the Strait of Malacca, right? This is something that I think an Indonesian government official had mooted publicly and then sort of walked back, right? I don't think it's the type of thing where overnight you're going to see these tolls set up, but sure. If you just think about the math for Iran, and I think this is really important. Iran has talked about a $2 million per ship toll at Hormuz, right? If you're a very large crude carrier with 2 million barrels that you're carrying, that's $1 a barrel. Commercially, it's not that significant, right? You're saying if $2 million is what it takes for me to get to market, that is a good deal, right? From the Iranian perspective, you take $2 million and you multiply it across every ship that's going to go through Hormuz in the year. You know how much money that is? $50 to $100 billion. An annuity that doesn't fluctuate with oil prices, that they just get. It basically doubles the revenue that they currently get from oil revenues. So it would be crazy for the Iranians to give this up. I think if they actually are able to institutionalize it, other countries are going to say, well, what kind of an annuity could I get? But that's why international orders are much harder to build than they are to tear down.
If we continue down the current path, who are the winners and who are the losers? Countries, industries, socioeconomic classes, et cetera.
Oh, man. So countries, I think I already named one, which is China. And actually, I'm shocked that I'm saying that, because when I was in government 10 years ago, whenever we modeled out what would happen in a war against Iran with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you would think China would be a big loser, right? Because they're the country that's importing most of the Gulf oil. But the fact that they have, A, stockpiled 1.5 billion barrels of oil, and B, invested so much in their domestic production of clean energy technologies, I think has turned them from a loser into a winner. Obviously, Iran will be a winner. They can set up a toll at Hormuz. Other Gulf countries like Saudi, UAE will be big losers, unfortunately, right? They're ones who had been sort of the ascendant powers in the region. I think they're going to be caught between a rock and a hard place. Do you double down on your alliance with the United States and allow sort of more U.S. Bases, more U.S. weapons, or do you try to accommodate Iran in order to get your oil out of the region? The developing world obviously is going to struggle a lot. I think that in the United States, we're in a real privileged position. You walk around here in New York City, you wouldn't even know most of the time, unless you're looking at the signs on gasoline stations, that there's this energy crisis going on. But if you go to the Philippines or Thailand or Singapore, or Sri Lanka, I mean, it's basically COVID-like conditions, right? You've got work from home, people who are, you're rationing gasoline where you can only fill up your tank one day a week. So the developing world is going to suffer quite a lot coming out of that. In terms of socioeconomic classes, I mentioned earlier, in the United States, given the fact that we are the world's biggest producer of oil and natural gas, there are winners and losers, even sort of at the more regional and socioeconomic level. I think that big energy companies, big oil companies in the United States obviously are going to win. Some of these oil-producing regions will probably see a boost from this, but the vast majority of Americans are going to suffer, and particularly poorer Americans that they're filling up their gas tank isn't optional. They have to do it to commute to work, or and it's eating up their disposable income.
I was watching CNN this morning. They had an economist on who said the exact same thing you just did, the impact to people in the United States. So as you play this out, it's going to take a while for this there are different doors to go through. It's going to take a while for all to play out. And even that, once it plays out, it's going to take some time for things to normalize, if you will. What's, in your experience, if you were advising the president today in the administration, what would you be suggesting as the paths forward? Are there choke points that we can take advantage of?
So, sorry, vis-a-vis Iran, I think we need to cut a deal. I'm very much against major military escalation. I don't think it makes much sense. And I think the dithering that we have right now isn't serving us well. On what goes into that deal, what I want to see out of it, I think getting something similar to the JCPOA is good for me. Get a 10-year, 15-year suspension of uranium enrichment, get the 60% high-enriched uranium out of the country. And then on Hormuz, what I would be pushing for is some kind of UN-backed international peacekeeping regime in the Strait of Hormuz, basically getting ships from third countries to patrol the strait to guarantee the safe passage of ships. The question is, why would Iran do this? I think you have to offer very substantial sanctions relief. If you can get the Iranians at the table, willing to give up the big parts of their nuclear program, willing to guarantee safe passage through the strait with a UN-backed sort of peacekeeping mission in the Strait of Hormuz, I would actually go further on sanctions relief than the Obama administration went in 2015 in order to compensate them for it.
Gotcha. And does that extend to other countries that are involved in the conflict as well?
What do you say?
Oh, sorry. So if you think about the president right now over meeting in China, Iran,
totally. So look, with China, it's a little different in that, with the U.S., with Iran, we have one goal right now, which is to end this war, reopen the strait, take care of the nuclear program. The U.S.-China relationship is incredibly multifaceted. There's so many different priorities we have, different equities that both sides have. One thing, and to your point about our choke points, that's top of mind for me, I think after China's rare earth export controls last year, it really shocked the White House and shocked Washington, right, in terms of how quickly China cutting off our access to rare earths could ricochet across the entire economy. And I think the approach has been twofold. One has been, stuff like Project Forge, Project Vault, where we're pouring in significant resources into indigenizing our clean energy or our rare earth supply chain. The other has been to seek détente with China, right? It's been actually the White House, there's been a White House official, anonymous, who came out and said that their strategy is similar to what Deng Xiaoping used to say, which is hide your strength, bide your time. Basically, don't poke China until we have resilience in rare earths. To me, like, I understand logically what that means, but it's extremely dangerous, right? So what's that mean? We can't do anything aggressive toward China for the next 5 years until we indigenize our rare earth supply chain. You have reports right now that Xi Jinping has told Trump that it's absolutely imperative for China to retake Taiwan, right? So is that something where we're just willing to sort of throw up our hands in the air and say, do what you will with Taiwan because you have us over a barrel on rare earths? I don't think that's right. I actually think we have substantial choke points that we could weaponize against China. The dollar, advanced semiconductors, jet engines, where China is completely dependent on the US. I would still rather have our arsenal in economic warfare than China's. The question is, can we establish some level of deterrence? Can we show the Chinese that if they are going to actually try to reimpose some of these more draconian rare earth restrictions that they put forward last fall, that we would actually retaliate financially, technologically, in ways that would be very damaging to them? And the idea is similar to how you have in the military domain or the nuclear domain, to have some level of deterrence, where both sides realize it's not worth shooting your weapons because the other side's going to hit you back really hard.
Appreciate that. We are out of time, so I'm going to ask you one last question to wrap up. So your choke points reads in part as a warning. So as you think about that on the hopeful side, what do you hope that readers, leaders, and others take from this and maybe get into as far as behavior changes go?
Look, the proliferation of economic warfare is not just taking down the old economic order. It's not just undoing globalization. It's actually actively building a new economic order, right? Every sanction, export control, industrial policy, tariff, what that's doing is it's reshaping trade and finance in ways that eventually will add up to something. I think we have a unique opportunity right now to actually think about what should a new global economic order look like? What would a new global economic system look like that actually serves America's interests? Those opportunities don't come often, right? We had Bretton Woods, we had the 70s with the Nixon shock, we had the end of the Cold War and sort of globalization of the WTO. That's the opportunity we have today. And I'm hopeful that if government, scholars, private sector can come together, we actually can put together a vision for a new global economic system that may help us with security without really sacrificing too much of our prosperity.
Gotcha. Eddie, thank you very much. Everybody, Eddie Fishman, and thanks very much for all this.
Thanks, man.
This is